Welcome to Research Bay. This podcast profiles researchers across all fields, uncovering their work, methods, and impact. Whether it's science, social research, or creative studies, we break it down into engaging conversations. The Research Bay podcast. Big ideas made simple. Hi, Ragi. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Ursula?
Thank you so much for joining us on the Research Bay podcast. When we started the podcast, we said, we want people from different faculties. This was myself and Edgar. But both of us having, background in health science, we find ourselves, leaning towards that direction. So having somebody from sociology is such an honor. Hi and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And so I believe you work at University of Johannesburg.
That's correct.
And you did your PhD via UCT.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so I am a lecturer at the University of Johannesburg in the sociology department.
Mm-hmm.
I teach mainly on questions of gender and society, but my research has been in migration, African migration in particular, and migration in the global south. So I try to think about what migration means for people, individuals, and society at large, and also interrogate what that means in terms of bigger ideologies we have around questions of identity and of belonging, such as Pan-Africanism, blackness, Africanity, the kind of things that come into question when we talk about the migration of people. So yeah, that's mostly what I do.
Where do your interests lie? Because it sounds like on the one end you're teaching around gender, and often what you teach as a lecturer and your research group aren't often exactly the same. They might be around the same sort of faculty, but not, usually don't exactly align. Where do your personal interests lie?
So my personal interests lie in questions of identity, right? The politics of identity.
Mm-hmm.
So ranging from race to gender to citizenship and national identities. But I think the bigger framing is questions of social justice. That's where I try to locate a lot of the questions I ask about, the politics of identity. What does it mean for social justice? And what does it mean when you envision a utopia? So I believe in imagining the world as it could be, and then trying to move our thinking and our ideologies in that direction. So when I teach, that's the framework with which I approach my work. Yeah.
I'm really interested. I do want to double tap on something there. However, I want us to look at specifically your research and PhD.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll answer a few questions via that route. Can you tell us what it is that you did and the structure of your study?
Okay, so as a second generation Congolese immigrant myself, what I was doing is exploring the lived experiences of second generation Congolese immigrants in South Africa. I was trying to understand their experiences of identity formation and of belonging in a country that's so highly framed by xenophobia and particularly afrophobia.
You see, you're getting to the answers of my questions. Yes.
So in doing that, I'm thinking a lot about myself. So I framed the title of my study around the idea of the mirror. It's called Mirrors in Frames. So the study is in part taking a mirror, looking into my life, but also using the mirror as a way to reflect what is happening in society. So as a feminist scholar, one of the key things I think about is how the personal is political. So I'm trying to look at what is it that we can learn about society by looking at the experiences of individuals really closely and seeing how that unpacks a lot of what is happening in the broader world. I'm also using it as a way to think about, terms that we throw around sometimes quite loosely, like Pan-Africanism, like I'm African or I'm Black, right? And trying to think that in a context where you've had Africans migrate to another African country, but still experience very heightened moments of exclusion and violence, but also, more importantly, the kind of exclusions and violence that exist in the everyday, in the mundane. what does that mean for the ways that identity is constructed, the ways that blackness is constructed, and questions of Africanity, right? So, yeah, I'm thinking about individual lived experiences, but also the big thing I was trying to do is think about a decolonial way of doing African scholarship that is accessible. So rather than writing in a very academic tone, my PhD is about stories. I write 6 stories. I write about 6 individuals, story format, and I conclude with poetry.
This is so interesting. Oh my goodness.
So yeah, I use poetry as my means of analysis. And yeah, so basically one of my contributions is methodological.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think about, okay, what is it that we can do as sociologists and as African theorists that help us conceptualize about our own lives, but also moves it like out of just merely the academic space, but is accessible and also like accessible and emancipating for my participants. Because I'm asking about the everyday, but I'm also asking about very difficult experiences.
Yeah, and things that are actually also difficult to explain.
Things that are also difficult to explain, right? So I try to look at ways to do that is, emancipating, that brings on a form of liberation, but that they could also access. So one of the things that I think is terrible about the academic world is that sometimes we write things that the people we are talking about struggle to understand. And I didn't want that. I wanted to do something that they can feel they contributed towards and can actually see themselves in. Hence the idea of the mirror, right? So the mirror is my reoccurring theme throughout the PhD.
You know what I find really interesting is that you speak of it as a decolonial way to look at academics. And it's true if you look at how African history was preserved and the learning and teaching was often in storytelling. That's a real African way to do things. And people often ask, what does decolonialized education look like? And I've never thought of it in that way. What if it looked like a story? What if it looked like the ability for us to sing a song or a poem? And so that's really, wow, that's a really beautiful angle that you looked at there. If you can tell us, you speak of 6 individuals. Did you have 6 participants in your whole study, or is it that you sort of did like a merged version of stories and turned it into an individual story? Or does each individual story represent an individual you spoke to?
Okay, so each story represents an individual I spoke to. I originally had 8 participants, 2 of which dropped out. So I worked with 6. But what I do, like, there's 3 chapters in which I present these stories, right? I try to find like congruences and, also moments of disjuncture between the stories and how I place them together, because I want the chapters to be read in particular ways, right? I wanted to provoke in particular ways. But then when I got to the actual analysis of the data, that's where I allow the stories and the poems particularly to merge into each other. So I unpack and I also bring it into conversation with other literature like Chimamanda, like Watson Shire. So people who have been writing about other forms of African migration, I bring them into the conversation and say, okay, I've got these stories that I created, and this is what exists out there in the literary world. This is also what exists about migrant lives in the academic world. And I try to piece the puzzle pieces together and create new stories, create a different mode of analysis.
Sure.
So yeah, it was really an in-depth look at. So 6 sounds like a small number for a PhD.
No. I hear you. But especially when you're telling somebody's life story. It isn't a small number.
It isn't. Let me tell you, it's not. I wish I went smaller. But really in-depth analysis, lots of conversations. So sometimes I'd spend like an entire day with my participants. I'd go to site visits with them, so places with which they have a strong resonance, strong sense of identity, talk with them about that, have them have conversations with other people, reflect on that with me. So it was quite a rigorous process, but also, I think, a very open and creative one.
This is cool.
Yeah.
While you're talking, I'm going to ask you what your key findings were, but I'm immediately thinking, because you're honing in on like a francophone country and being immigrants in South Africa and anglophone, that would be one of the layers that you maybe had to discuss and open up. Yeah, because I think there's definitely a different kind of acceptance when at least the language barrier isn't there, but it adds a whole different other layer when there's a language barrier as well on top of an accent barrier. And so there's so many things to overcome. So yeah, that would be my next question, to say, what were some of the key findings in your study?
Yeah, so like you're saying, Ursh, like the markers, I call those the markers of difference, right? Yeah. That's a really big one. So, I mean, a lot of the literature already speaks to how Francophone immigrants are singled out in a different way, because there's also like a different mode of dress, for example. So one of the chapters I look at dress, how my participants dress, how they think about, this expression of identity through dress. And that, in DRC, for example, wearing, I guess what people call here, like a kind of shoshe cloth, what we call kikwembe or lepany.
Okay.
That's like common everyday wear. Like that's what my mom wears on a general, right? Yeah. But it's also a marker of difference in this context.
Yes.
The language, the accent, the dark skin, all the things that people look out for when there's a xenophobic attack, for example, right? So the things that single people out. But one of my findings was around how these kind of things are negotiated and how it evolves over time. So I looked at, for example, experiences in childhood, where being in Model C schools, being able to speak English in particular ways, because the accent is already different.
Yes.
Easily sounding a lot more white, and the kind of assumptions that people make when you sound more white, right? Assumptions around affluence, around positionality, and how in younger years this actually made my participants feel
othered.
No, othered, but in a good way, because they already felt distanced from Black South Africans. So being able to be placed in the category that is closer to whiteness was a particular kind of social positioning and an opportunity for a kind of social mobility.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And how that shifts when you get older, right? When you start interrogating yourself, interrogating ideas around blackness and Africanity, but you are still so divorced from what blackness means in the South African context. So that constant negotiation of space and of identity.
So what you're saying is, as a second generation foreign immigrant, you go to school, there's this combination of like black and white kids, and because you can only speak one language of the languages that are before you, so English, and you start assimilating to more the white sort of group, or like a very, I don't know what the word is, but whiteness. People start placing you within a certain, she's a Model C kid, and but you're saying this disassociates you from the current black culture that exists there, because when you go back home, nobody's speaking Sotho or Zulu, and you can't relate to that. And so the older you grow and you start finding yourself wanting to be more of yourself, meaning more black, and you feel like your blackness is closer to Zulu and Sotho than it is to whiteness, then you start having identity issues. Is that what you're saying?
Something like that. Except I'm not saying that it's closer to Zulu and Sotho. It still feels very
foreign and
very
removed.
foreign, very divorced, right? There's what I noticed was like a kind of admiration for like South African culture, the way that it's embraced, but still a distance from it because of the experiences of xenophobia. And this happens from childhood already, with kids who will call you kwere kwere, right?
Yes.
And how in response to that you lean more towards other white children. And then you grow up and you're constantly negotiating that kind of space. And then there's also the reality that I give an analogy in my thesis about my own context where my parents would say that South Africa is out there, but from this fence, you're in Congo. So you don't have the South African constitution or, all of that you have out there.
Yeah.
Like Mandela's country is out there.
Yes.
Here it's in Congo.
Yeah.
So it's a proximity to your own cultural context, but one that is also framed and fragmented because of migration. So in the same way that you feel divorced from blackness in South Africa, there's also a kind of distance that occurs with what it means to be Congolese, because that shifts when you are in South Africa. And I talk a lot about return as well. So a lot of us grew up with the idea of return because our parents imagined that they would return back to the DRC and would prepare us for return. There was also the idea of return in the context that we get kicked out of South Africa, right? So you need to be prepared to go home.
Anytime, yeah.
But in the moments that my participants did visit home, there was also that distance. There was also, once again, questions of whiteness, being told that you are white, right? Because of the South African upbringing, the English, the kinds of access and modalities that they are used to in this context that are not necessarily a reality in the DRC. So all these moments where you are constantly seeking a kind of solid identity and an identity that is rooted in like a national background, but that doesn't necessarily exist in your real world anymore.
There's this quote that I like, and I'm trying to look for the person that says it. Too foreign for here, too foreign for there.
Yes.
Never enough for both.
Yes.
So you find yourself as an immigrant feeling very foreign in South Africa, and you go back home to what's supposed to be home, Congo, and feeling very foreign there. And in both spaces, you're never enough.
Exactly.
And that's interesting. I want to know, like now we're on a platform and somebody's saying, okay, what's the impact of your findings? So Ursula sitting at home is listening, saying, hey, I'm second generation. What are the impact? Me understanding your study and the findings of your study, what does that mean and what does that do for me?
Okay. So can I tell you what I imagined, or rather what I felt my impact should be when I started off, and what I'm proud that it is now? So initially, I think also because of my professional background, I worked in a research institution for a long time. I kept trying to see how my work would fit into like making a policy contribution, right? Changing legislation in some way or another. But as I actually did the study and also like in consultation with my supervisors and stuff, I realized that there's something different that I'm doing and something that is more true to my actual interests. And that is helping people think differently about experiences. So I think there's very narrow ways that we try to imagine people's lives, for one, and imagine our own lives. And I pick up on this in the thesis as well, that I keep seeing myself and my participants try to negotiate space into a particular box, like wanting to say, yes, I am Congolese. Yes, I am South African, or no, I'm not, right? But things are not that simple. Things are not that clean. There's this liminality, right? So liminality is what we refer to as an in-between space. It's a concept that refers to this in-between space. And that's what I'm trying to bring to the table, that in speaking about human lives, there is the reality of liminality, of in-betweenness, of gray areas. People don't fit seamlessly into fixed boxes. And I'm trying to bring up that conversation in a space where a lot of times, even in whether it's public discourse, political discourse, people try to speak in these very rigid ways. And it's not just about like migration at a continental level or a global level. But even very recently in South Africa, for example, we had a political party in the Western Cape contesting people from the Eastern Cape moving to the Western Cape. Like this idea of trying to box people into rigid spaces, of trying to limit movement, right? So what I'm trying to do is bring up a conversation. And that's the main contribution of my study, right? Having the work be written in a way that is largely accessible, right? Like I really want people to be able to read my work, understand it, and also relate to it in particular ways that make them question their own positionality, their own taken for granted ideas. I also am trying to show how speaking about one topic doesn't preclude you from speaking about many topics. So, for example, I have a chapter that is largely focused on one of my participants' relationship with their mother, because that's what came up when we were talking. And she talks about like wrestling a very tense relationship with her mother. But I show how looking at her relationship with her mother mirrors a lot of what she's experienced as an immigrant in South Africa. So I'm trying to like unveil different ways or more poetic ways of analyzing people's lives and understanding people's lives. So that's my contribution, like making academia accessible, thinking of how to communicate science in a way that is decolonized, that is accessible, but also like opening up ideas around who people are and where they belong.
I really like what you're saying, especially around the, box activity of like, are you South African? Are you Congolese? Because I remember it used to give me so much anxiety in school when they'd say you must check the box Zulu, Sotho, Xhosa. Even now I feel very limited when it's like, are you black, colored, white? And and I'm always like, give me an opportunity to explain my heritage. So I love what you're saying, because there's something about denying a part of yourself when you just click one, and you've done lovely work. I've enjoyed this chat so much. It wouldn't be an academic podcast if we didn't touch on funding. If you could just walk us through, what did it look like? Did you need funding at all? If you did, what did it look like? What was the process like?
I feel like I should have come with my little caption that I said in my contracts with I am grateful for the funding.
Yes.
But listen, I was very fortunate to receive funding for my study. So from when I developed my proposal, I'm grateful that it landed in the right hands, and it was strong enough for me to receive funding. So I got funding from the National Research Foundation, through the Center of Excellence in Human Development. After that, I also received funding through my position at UJ as an in-gap scholar. So there's been like opportunities to fund like my conference attendance, different like equipment that I need, just, basics like, so I wouldn't need the same kind of equipment you do.
Yes.
So just things like my laptop, my recorder, sometimes also being able to fund the space in which to have the conversation.
Oh, yes.
So as someone who has conversations regularly, you would know that space is an important thing, right?
Absolutely.
So being able to take my participants to a place outside their home, for exple.
Yes.
If
so
we're
you
going
can
to be
talk about
talking about your mom.
freely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Being able to give my participants something to eat, those sound like menial things, but this is actually what creates the comfort and makes or breaks your research process.
Absolutely. Over a process of 5 years, it can be quite taxing,
Yeah. So I think like a big thing with the funding is being able to make a good case for yourself, a good case for why the study is important, and also approaching the right people. It's, with the current administration in certain faraway lands, it is getting a bit more difficult to get research funding. But yeah, I think knocking on the right doors helped me a lot. And yeah,
Thank you. Sure. Thank you so much. If you've got any closing remarks for any upcoming researchers beyond you, behind you, around you, if you could just share, like, just your parting shot.
I think I'll end with this. Something I say a lot to like my students or colleagues is, well, I find that researchers often wear their hearts on their sleeves, right? So when you look at people's research topics, you kind of get a sense of
who they
are and what drives them. And I think that's really important, like to actually look for something that's important to you and let that moment drive you. Let your research speak, like convince and convict you, and let that drive the work that you do. And yeah, I think the outcomes will speak for itself.
Ragi Bashonga, from the School or Department of Sociology?
Department
of Sociology. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.